The Nexus Combat Evaluation Arena represented everything the Galactic Military Academy believed about civilized warfare: pristine, regulated, and utterly predictable. Located in the heart of the Academy's most prestigious wing, the arena gleamed with polished neutronium walls and force field barriers that could allegedly withstand the fury of a collapsing star, which was fortunate, really, because today's participants had a tendency toward spectacular property damage. The Academy's monthly elite trials had become something of a social event among the galaxy's more militaristically inclined species. Today's crowd buzzed with the particular energy of beings who had traveled considerable distances to watch someone get their metaphorical teeth kicked in. The Zephyrian contingent dominated the premium seating, their crystalline exoskeletons clicking together in what passed for polite conversation among a species that considered casual violence a form of small talk. "Magnificent turnout for the General's demonstration," chittered Ambassador Vexai, his mandibles practically vibrating with anticipation. "Though I confess myself puzzled by the Academy's choice of opponent." His companion, a towering Altarian, whose species measured success by the number of smaller beings they could intimidate before breakfast, gestured toward the arena floor with one of his forearms. Yes, the exchange student. Curious little creature, isn't she?" The subject of their discussion stood exactly 5 feet and 6 inches of unimpressive mammalian biomass, looking about as threatening as a domesticated garden implement, while every other participant in the elite trials stood between 7 and 12 feet tall, possessed natural armor plating, or could breathe toxic gases. The human representative appeared to have been assembled from spare parts by a committee with a severe shortage of intimidating features. She wore standard Academy training gear, a simple gray bodysuit that looked like it had been designed by someone who had heard the concept of protective equipment described over a bad subspace connection. No ceremonial battle scars, no genetic modifications, no cybernetic enhancements that could be seen from orbit. Just a bipedal mammal with an unremarkable face and the kind of relaxed posture that suggested she might be mentally cataloging her grocery list. "The humans call this diversity in military exchange programs," Ambassador Vexai explained, consulting his datapad with the air of someone reading a particularly amusing obituary. "Apparently, they believe exposure to advanced combat techniques will prove education." "How wonderfully optimistic of them," the Altarian replied. "Though I suspect today's lesson will be rather more pointed than they anticipated." General Koreth Vexane entered the arena with all the subtlety of a gravitational anomaly. His power armor alone cost more than most planetary defense budgets, a masterpiece of Zephyrian military engineering that had been passed down through 12 generations of elite warriors. The suit stood 9 feet tall, gleaming with adaptive camouflage plating that shifted through patterns of intimidating colors like a very expensive mood ring designed by someone with serious anger management issues. The General's combat record read like a catalog of creative ways to reduce enemy forces to their component atoms: 347 victories in formal duels, countless battlefield commendations, and a personal body count that required scientific notation to express properly. His armor bore the scars of encounters with some of the galaxy's most dangerous predators, each mark carefully preserved as a testament to Zephyrian superiority. "Behold," announced the arena's commentator, "a being whose entire species had evolved specifically to provide dramatic narration for sporting events." General Koreth Vexane, a scourge of the Outer Rim, breaker of siege lines, and holder of the Academy's record for fastest opponent neutralization. The crowd erupted in appreciative clicking, roaring, and various other sounds that indicated approval among species whose idea of applause might accidentally cause hearing damage to lesser beings. And in the challenger's corner, the commentator continued, his enthusiasm notably diminished. "Representing the Terran exchange program, we have a human." The silence that followed could have been weaponized. "That's it," called out someone from the cheaper seats. "No titles, no honorific, no list of conquered worlds. Humans don't conquer worlds," explained a scholarly Centaurian from the academic section. "They prefer what they call peaceful colonization, which apparently involves settling on planets no sane species would consider habitable, and then acting surprised when the local wildlife tries to eat them." "How delightfully naive," General Koreth's voice boomed through his armor's external speakers, modulated to achieve maximum intimidation effect. "Tell me, little mammal, Do you have any last words before I demonstrate why the Zephyrian Empire has never lost a formal challenge? The human looked up at him with the kind of mild interest one might show when examining an unusual cloud formation. Actually, I was wondering about your armor's joint articulation system. Is that based on traditional servo mechanics? Or did you upgrade to the newer neural link interface? The question hung in the air like an awkward silence at a funeral. What? General Korath's confusion was audible even through his voice modulator. It's just that the shoulder mounting looks like it might have some mobility limitations in close quarters, she continued conversational. But I'm sure you've tested all the weak points thoroughly. Several spectators began placing hasty bets on how quickly the general would reduce his opponent to a fine mist. The odds were not in the human's favor. General Korath recovered from his momentary confusion with all the grace of a falling asteroid, which is to say he made a lot of noise and left a considerable impression on everyone within the immediate blast radius. Weak point. His laughter reverberated through the arena like the sound of grinding metal having an argument with itself. Little mammal. This armor has withstood plasma cannons, gravity hammers, and the concentrated fury of a draconian berserker pack. It is a masterwork of defensive engineering, crafted by the finest artisans in the Empire and tested against every conceivable form of attack. The human nodded thoughtfully, as if he were explaining the finer points of flower arrangement, rather than describing military hardware capable of reducing small moons to cosmic dust. That's impressive. What about inconceivable forms of attack? The question sailed over the general's head like a particularly obtuse philosophical concept. He gestured grandly with one armored gauntlet, activating a holographic display that projected his suit's technical specifications into the air above the arena floor. The statistics scrolled past in a dizzying array of numbers that would have made a mathematician weep with either joy or terror. "Behold the Sovereign Class Mark 7 battle armor," he announced, his voice taking on the tone of someone reading from a very expensive brochure. Reactive nano-weave plating with adaptive density modulation, integrated weapon systems with 17 targeting protocols, environmental seals rated for everything from hard vacuum to the crushing depths of gas giant atmosphere. And he paused for dramatic effect. A neural interface so sophisticated it responds to the wearer's thoughts faster than most organic beings can even form them. The crowd murmured appreciatively at this recitation, like diners at a fancy restaurant having the wine list explained by an overly enthusiastic sommelier. "The power core alone," General Korath continued, warming to his subject, "generates enough energy to supply a small city. The servo-assisted musculature amplifies the wearer's strength by a factor of 37. The defensive barriers can deflect directed energy weapons up to Class 9 intensity. In short, this armor doesn't just protect its occupant, it transforms them into a walking force of nature." "Fascinating," the human replied, examining her fingernails with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for complex mathematical proofs. "And how much does it weigh?" "Weight?" The general's confusion was palpable. The suit masses approximately 2.3 metric tons. But the internal gravitic compensators reduce the effective. "No, I mean how much does it actually weigh?" she interrupted. "Right now, in standard gravity, without any technological assistance." "Well, 2.3 metric tons obviously. But as I explained, the compensators." "Right. So if something happened to those compensators, you'd be carrying 2.3 tons of metal." An uncomfortable silence settled over the arena like fog rolling in from a particularly ominous harbor. Several spectators began to sense that this conversation was heading somewhere they weren't entirely sure they wanted to follow. "Nothing is going to happen to the compensators," General Korath declared with the confidence of someone who had never met Murphy's Law. "They're triple redundant, quantum encrypted and protected by more safeguards than the Academy's lunch budget." "Of course," the human agreed pleasantly. "I'm sure whoever designed them thought of everything." Meanwhile, in the betting pools scattered throughout the arena's upper levels, odds were being recalculated with the frantic energy of beings who had suddenly realized they might have misunderstood something fundamental about the situation. The Zephyrian bookmakers, whose species had elevated gambling to an art form roughly equivalent to advanced theoretical physics, found themselves staring at numbers that made increasingly less sense. 10,000 credits says the mammal doesn't survive the first 30 seconds, announced a Regillian trader, his multiple eyes blinking in sequence like a malfunctioning traffic signal. "Taken," replied a voice from the academic section. "Though I'll raise you another 5,000 that she doesn't even try to run." "Are we watching the same fight?" the Regillian demanded. "She's barely waist-high to the general," She's carrying no visible weapons, and her only equipment appears to be whatever the Academy gives to first-year cadets who haven't figured out which end of a plasma rifle produces the dangerous bit. Exactly, the academic replied with the satisfied air of someone who had spotted a particularly elegant mathematical proof, which raises the interesting question of why she requested this specific opponent. That piece of information rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. The human hadn't been assigned to face General Korith as some sort of cruel joke or bureaucratic oversight. She had specifically requested him. Down in the arena, the general was warming to his pre-combat intimidation routine, a time-honored tradition among Zephyrian warriors that typically involved detailed descriptions of exactly how thoroughly one's opponent was about to be dismantled. It was considered poor form to skip this part, roughly equivalent to serving dinner without appropriate garnish. "When I am finished with you, little mammal," he intoned, his armor's speakers adding helpful echo effects for maximum dramatic impact. "They will use your defeat as a cautionary tale in xenobiology classes. This, they will say, is what happens when evolution produces a species too soft for the galaxy's realities." The human listened to this speech with the polite attention of someone waiting for a particularly long-winded relative to finish explaining their vacation slides. When he paused for breath or whatever Zephyrians did instead of breathing, she raised one hand slightly. "Just to clarify," she said, "when you say finished with me, are we talking about the standard Academy combat parameters? First to yield, technical knockout or complete incapacitation?" "I was thinking more along the lines of unrecognizable biological residue," General Korith replied helpfully. "Well, in that case," the human said, settling into what looked suspiciously like a combat stance despite appearing as threatening as a mildly concerned librarian, "I should probably mention that my species tends to take these things personally." And with that ominous observation hanging in the air like an unexploded ordnance, the arena's countdown timer began its final sequence. 10 seconds to combat initiation. 9. The general activated his weapon systems with flourishes that would have made a concert pianist weep with envy. 7. 6. The human stood perfectly still, apparently fascinated by something in the middle distance. 5. 4. General Korith began his charge, 2.3 tons of advanced military hardware thundering across the arena floor like an avalanche with anger management issues. 3. 2. The human girl stood motionless. 0. For exactly 12 seconds, absolutely nothing happened, which, in a galaxy where nothing happening was generally considered a prelude to something catastrophically interesting, made those 12 seconds feel roughly equivalent to a geological. The general's charge had brought him to within arm's reach of his opponent, his armor's targeting systems painting helpful little crosshairs over what they optimistically assumed were vital organs. His weapon arrays hummed with barely contained energy, ready to demonstrate why the Zephyrian Empire had never met a problem they couldn't solve through the judicious application of overwhelming firepower. The human remained exactly where she had been standing, hands at her sides, looking for all the galaxy like someone waiting for a particularly slow elevator. Her breathing was steady, her posture was relaxed, her expression suggested she might be mentally reviewing a shopping list, possibly debating whether she had enough milk for the week. 12 seconds of this. The arena's chronometer helpfully displayed the standoff for everyone to see, counting off each moment with the mechanical precision of a device that had no idea it was witnessing something that would require several committees of theoretical physicists to properly explain later. Then the human moved. To say she moved quickly would be like saying that novae are somewhat bright or that black holes have a modest gravitational influence. The arena's high-speed recording equipment, designed to capture combat footage for later analysis, registered her motion as a blur that seemed to violate several fundamental principles of physics, while making rude gestures at the rest. She didn't run, she didn't leap, she didn't execute any of the flashy combat maneuvers that Academy instructors spent years drilling into their students' heads. Instead, she simply stepped forward and reached out with both hands, like someone about to give a friend a particularly enthusiastic hug. What happened next would require teams of xenobiologists, engineers and possibly exorcists, to fully document. The general's targeting systems, those 17 sophisticated protocols designed to track and eliminate threats across multiple spectrums, suddenly found themselves with absolutely nothing to lock onto. One moment their opponent had been directly in front of them, helpfully stationary and well within optimal firing range. The next moment, she was somehow inside their engagement envelope, having apparently traveled through the intervening space without actually occupying any of. Impossible.
General Korath had just enough time to declare before discovering that the universe had a peculiar sense of humor about such absolute statements. The human's hands made contact with his armor's chest plating, and several things happened in very rapid succession, most of which defied the Academy's understanding of how reality was supposed to function. First, the armor's gravitic compensators experienced what the technical manual would later describe as a catastrophic interpretation error regarding the local physics environment. The compensators, those triple redundant, quantum encrypted marvels of engineering, suddenly decided that they were no longer interested in compensating for anything, and shut down with the electronic equivalent of a resigned sigh. Second, 2.3 metric tons of Zephyrian military hardware remembered that it weighed 2.3 metric tons, and began demonstrating this fact with considerable enthusiasm. Third, the armor's adaptive nano-weave plating, designed to deflect everything from plasma bolts to antimatter warheads, encountered a type of stress it had never been programmed to handle. Someone who apparently viewed impossibly strong materials as a personal challenge. The human's grip tightened. Reality took one look at what was happening, and decided it might be a good time to take a short break. The sound that followed was like someone trying to gift-wrap a thunderstorm using nothing but willpower and poor life choices. Metal shrieked, energy systems sparked and died. Warning alarms began playing a symphony of distress that sounded suspiciously like the universe crying for help. General Korath, safely ensconced inside what had been the galaxy's most advanced personal protection system, experienced the unique sensation of watching his invincible armor fold inward like origami being assembled by an overly enthusiastic child. The heads-up display that had been providing him with helpful tactical information suddenly became extremely interested in displaying error messages in languages he was fairly certain didn't exist yet. "This is not possible," he announced to anyone who might be listening, which at the moment included several thousand spectators, whose jaws had apparently forgotten how to close. "The structural integrity of this armor exceeds the compressive strength of..." His lecture on materials science was interrupted by the discovery that his magnificent suit was now roughly the size and shape of a very expensive metal egg, with him still inside it. The arena fell silent except for the gentle pinging sounds of cooling metal and the distant whimpering of several Zephyrian engineers, who were having what could charitably be described as professional nervous breakdown. The human stepped back, dusting off her hands with the satisfied air of someone who had just finished a particularly rewarding bit of spring cleaning. The general's compressed armor sat on the arena floor like a metallic sculpture dedicated to the concept of learning experience. "Technical knockout," announced the arena's commentator, his voice cracking slightly as his species' legendary composure encountered something it wasn't quite prepared for. "Winner by..." He paused, apparently consulting several different rulebooks simultaneously. "By innovative materials compression." In the premium seating, Ambassador Vexay stared at the scene below with the expression of someone who had just watched the fundamental laws of physics submit a resignation letter. His datapad, which moments before had been displaying helpful statistics about human physical capabilities, was now showing nothing but question marks and what appeared to be small digital representations of beings having existential crises. "Did she just..." he began. "Compress a sovereign-class battlesuit using nothing but manual force," his Altarian companion finished. Yes, I believe she did. But that's impossible. The energy requirements alone would require more power than most star systems generate," the Altarian agreed, which raises some interesting questions about exactly what these humans consider normal physical exercise. Down in the arena, the human was examining the compressed armor with the critical eye of someone evaluating their handiwork. She tapped it once with her knuckle, producing a hollow metallic sound that somehow managed to convey both the general's continued presence inside and his complete inability to do anything about his current situation. "Are you comfortable in there?" she asked politely. A muffled voice emerged from somewhere within the metal egg, speaking in the measured tones of someone who was having to reassess several fundamental assumptions about the universe. "I appear to be experiencing some mobility limitation." "Well, that's what happens when you rely too heavily on technology," she replied helpfully. "Would you like me to help you out of that?" The silence that followed suggested that General Korath was contemplating whether accepting assistance from someone who had just compressed his invincible armor might constitute a blow to his professional dignity that would follow him for the rest of his very long life. Then again, his current alternative was spending the foreseeable future as a very expensive paperweight. That would be appreciated, he admitted. What followed was perhaps the most polite armor extraction in galactic military history. The human worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who had clearly done this sort of thing before, carefully peeling back layers of compressed metal like someone opening a particularly stubborn package. Within minutes, General Korath emerged from his technological cocoon, looking remarkably intact for someone who had just experienced what could charitably be described as aggressive metallurgical reorganization. He stood there for a moment, blinking in the arena's lights, apparently trying to reconcile his current state of being unharmed with his recent state of being compressed into a geometric impossibility. His armor lay around him in neat strips of metal that looked like they had been folded by someone with an advanced degree in origami and a disturbing amount of patience. "How?" he asked, which was arguably the most important question anyone had posed all day. The human shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both modesty and the casual acknowledgement that she had just redefined several branches of material science, leverage, mostly, and a basic understanding of structural engineering. Leverage. General Korath's voice cracked slightly. "You compressed quantum-hardened battle armor with leverage. Well, that and a few other things," she admitted. "Growing up on a death world tends to teach you some interesting problem-solving techniques." The arena's crowd, which had been maintaining a stunned silence that could have been bottled and sold as a meditation aid, suddenly erupted into a cacophony of confused chittering, roaring, and various other sounds that indicated beings trying to process information their brains weren't quite equipped to handle. "Death world," Ambassador Vex High's voice carried across the arena with the tone of someone who had just realized he might have misunderstood something rather important. "I thought Earth was classified as a Class M garden world. Temperate climate, abundant water, suitable for standard carbon-based life forms." "Oh, it is," the human replied cheerfully. "We just happen to share it with everything else that evolved there, which includes a few things that consider us a light snack." She began ticking off items on her fingers with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. "Sharks that can bite through steel, spiders whose venom dissolves organic matter, plants that can kill you just by touching them, microscopic organisms that treat your immune system like a personal challenge, weather patterns that regularly produce winds capable of leveling cities, seismic activity that rearranges entire continents, and approximately 14 million other species that evolution designed specifically to prove that survival of the fittest isn't just a theory, it's a daily practical examination." The silence that followed this recitation was the kind typically reserved for moments when entire worldviews collapse under the weight of new information. "You mean," General Korath said slowly, "that your species evolved in an environment where everything was actively trying to kill you?" "Pretty much," she confirmed. "Which is why we developed a few interesting adaptations: enhanced bone density, redundant organ systems, accelerated healing, improved reflexes, and muscle fibers that can generate about 15 times more force than most carbon-based species consider theoretically possible." 15 times. The general's voice had taken on the tone of someone doing very unpleasant mathematics in his head. "On a good day," she added helpfully, "when we're not particularly motivated." The Academy's medical scanners probably classified all of that as normal baseline human parameters, because, well, for us it is normal. We don't usually mention the specifics, because most species find it a bit unsettling. Indeed, several members of the audience were beginning to look distinctly unsettled, as if they had just discovered that their comfortable assumptions about the universe's more manageable species might need some urgent revision. "But surely," protested a voice from the academic section, "your technology must compensate for these environmental pressures. Advanced planetary defense systems, climate control, predator management program." The human's laugh was not unkind, but it carried undertones that suggested she found the suggestion adorable, in the way one might find a child's drawing of their family pet adorable, even when said pet happened to be a saber-toothed tiger. "We tried that for a while," she said. "Built cities, developed agriculture, created civilizations. But every few thousand years, something would happen: ice age, asteroid impact, volcanic eruption, pandemic, and we'd have to start over. Eventually, we figured out it was easier to just adapt to whatever the planet threw at us, rather than trying to make it stop." "Adapt how?" General Korath asked, though from his expression, he was beginning to suspect he might not want to know the answer. "Well, when your environment regularly tries to crush, burn, freeze, poison, or eat you, you develop a certain flexibility in your approach to problem solving. Most species encounter an impossible situation and think, this can't be overcome. We encounter an impossible situation and think, I wonder if I can solve this with my bare hands." She gestured toward the compressed remains of the general's armor. "Take your suit, for example. Beautifully engineered, absolutely magnificent technology, probably took decades to perfect, but it was designed by beings who think of force as something you apply through machines. We think of force as something you apply through creative applications of physics, and a willingness to ignore conventional limitations. The Academy's Dean of Combat Studies, a distinguished Procyon, whose species had spent millennia perfecting the art of civilized warfare, raised one of his 16 tentacles in what passed for a question among his people. "Are you suggesting," he said carefully, "that your species routinely exceeds the performance parameters of advanced military hardware through biological adaptation?" "Not routinely," the human corrected. "Only when the situation calls for it. Most of the time, we're perfectly happy to use tools and technology like everyone else. It's just that when those tools aren't available, or when they're not quite up to the task, we have alternatives." "What sort of alternatives?" the dean asked, though from his tone, he was clearly dreading the answer. The human considered this question, with the thoughtful expression of someone choosing items from a particularly extensive menu. "Well, there's the obvious stuff: running faster than most ground vehicles, lifting things that weigh several times our body mass, surviving in environments that would kill most species in minutes. But we've also gotten pretty good at what you might call adaptive problem solving under extreme pressure, such as compressing battle armor." Apparently, the arena fell silent again, the kind of silence that indicated several thousand beings simultaneously reconsidering their basic assumptions about the galaxy's power structures. General Korath looked down at the artistic arrangement of metal strips that had once been his invincible armor, then back at the unassuming human who had reduced it to abstract art through the simple application of manual force and creative thinking. "I believe," he said finally, "that I may have underestimated your species." "Most people do," she replied with a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring, but somehow managed to suggest that underestimating humans was the kind of mistake one generally only made once. "We're used to it by now." And with that observation, the great revelation was complete. The Academy would spend the next several months urgently revising their threat assessment protocols. The Zephyrian Empire would quietly cancel their planned expansion into human space, and General Korath would develop a healthy respect for species that evolution had designed as living stress tests for the universe's sense of fair play.
As for the human, she collected her gear with a satisfied air of someone who had just completed a moderately interesting training exercise, waved politely to the stunned crowd, and headed off to her next class, leaving behind an arena full of beings who were beginning to understand that in a galaxy full of advanced civilizations, sometimes the most dangerous species was the one that had learned to be civilized, despite everything in its environment trying to prevent it. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony that extended well beyond simple physics violations.